The courtroom was silent as Judge Theodore Grayson leaned back in his chair, a smug smile spreading across his face. His voice, dripping with condescension, echoed through the room. "Miss Carter, are you aware of where you are?" he asked, addressing a teenage girl with messy curls, dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans. Her sneakers squeaked slightly as she shifted uncomfortably on the polished floor. "This is a court of law, not some high school debate team." Laughter rippled across the room. The attorneys seated behind their desks exchanged amused glances. The girl stood alone at the defendant's table, clutching a stack of papers that seemed almost too heavy for her small frame. Her cheeks flushed, but her eyes remained steady, locked on the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm despite the jeers. "I'm here to—" Judge Grayson cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Save it. This court doesn't have time for juvenile antics. I don't even know why this nonsense was allowed." The girl raised her chin, her voice firm. "If you would let me speak, Your Honor, you might find it worth your time." The courtroom gasped. The audacity of a teenager speaking to a judge like that was unheard of. Judge Grayson leaned forward, his smirk deepening into a scowl. "Well, by all means," he said mockingly. "Enlighten us all." The girl took a deep breath, adjusted the papers in her hand, and began. What happened next left the courtroom in stunned silence. As she spoke, delivering a seamless argument, citing legal precedents, constitutional clauses, and court procedures, it became clear she wasn't just any teenager. She was knowledgeable, confident, and astonishingly correct. The attorneys who had been laughing moments earlier were now furiously scribbling notes. Judge Grayson's expression shifted from amusement to disbelief. "Who are you?" he finally blurted out, leaning forward in his seat. His voice no longer carried mockery, but genuine bewilderment. The girl stopped, met his gaze, and smiled slightly. "I'm Amelia Carter," she said, "and I'm here to defend my client." The room erupted into chaos, questions flying from every direction. The judge banged his gavel, demanding order, but his own composure was clearly shaken. How could a teenager hold the courtroom captive with such authority? Who had allowed this? What was going on? And that's when Amelia's calm smile faltered for the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face. The courtroom quieted again, all eyes on her. What was she about to reveal? 2 weeks earlier, Amelia Carter sat in her small bedroom, surrounded by law books and legal pads. The books weren't hers. They belonged to her older brother, James, who had been studying to pass the bar exam. But James wasn't around anymore, and Amelia had made it her mission to learn everything he had. Her best friend, Lily, called her crazy. "What are you even doing?" Lily had asked one afternoon, sitting cross-legged on Amelia's bed and munching on a bag of chips. "You're, like, 16. You're not a lawyer." Amelia's fingers paused over her notebook, where she had been writing out case summaries. She looked up at Lily, her expression serious. "I don't care what people think. I have to do this." "But why?" Lily pressed, her voice softening. "Why can't you just let it go?" Amelia didn't answer right away. Instead, she flipped through one of James's old textbooks, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Finally," she said, "because someone has to stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. And James believed I could do it." Lily didn't argue after that. Instead, she watched as her best friend poured herself into studying, preparing for something that seemed impossible. What Amelia didn't tell Lily, what she didn't tell anyone, was that her obsession with the law wasn't just about helping others. It was about proving something to herself. After James's death, people had treated her like a fragile child. Teachers, neighbors, even her own parents, had started tiptoeing around her as if one wrong word might break her. But she wasn't fragile, and she wasn't a child. She was smart, she was determined, and she was going to show everyone that she could make a difference. Back in the courtroom, Amelia's composure had returned, but the atmosphere was tense. Judge Grayson, still visibly flustered, leaned back in his chair and studied her closely. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, "you're telling me you're representing the defendant?" Amelia nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "And where exactly did you study law?" he asked, his tone skeptical but no longer mocking. "I didn't go to law school, if that's what you're asking," she replied, her voice steady. "But I've spent the last year studying legal texts and court procedures. I've read every case related to this matter, and I believe I'm qualified to represent my client." The judge raised an eyebrow. You believe you're qualified? That's not how this works. Amelia didn't flinch. Then let me prove it. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone waited to see what the judge would do next. Judge Grayson opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door at the back of the courtroom swung open. A tall man in a crisp suit strode in. Your Honor, the man said, his deep voice carrying across the room. I believe I can shed some light on this situation. Amelia turned to look at him, her confident expression finally slipping into one of uncertainty. Who was this man, and what did he want? The tall man's presence commanded attention. He walked with an air of authority, his briefcase swinging lightly in his hand. His sharp gray suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to Amelia's simple outfit. The courtroom's focus shifted entirely to him, murmurs growing louder as people speculated about his identity and purpose. Excuse me, sir, Judge Grayson said, his tone regaining its authority. Who are you, and what business do you have interrupting my courtroom? The man stopped just before the bench, placing his briefcase gently on the table. He turned to face the judge and gave a respectful nod. My apologies, Your Honor. My name is Daniel Hayes, and I'm here as a representative of the Bar Association. The courtroom buzzed with surprise. Amelia's heart raced as she stared at the man, trying to figure out his intentions. Why would someone from the Bar Association be here? Was this about? Her grip on the stack of papers tightened. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. The Bar Association? What interest do they have in this case? Mr. Hayes opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder, flipping through a few pages before responding. It's not the case itself, Your Honor. It's the matter of representation. He glanced briefly at Amelia before continuing. We received an anonymous tip about an unlicensed individual attempting to represent a client in court. Naturally, this is a matter we take very seriously. The air in the room felt heavy. Amelia's stomach dropped. She had worked tirelessly for this moment, and now it felt like everything was about to unravel. She swallowed hard and forced herself to stand tall. Unlicensed, Judge Grayson repeated, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Well, Mr. Hayes, I'm sure you can see why this is highly irregular. As I was just saying, Miss Carter has no formal legal training. Her presence here is questionable at best. Before Mr. Hayes could respond, Amelia stepped forward. Her voice was firm, but there was an edge of desperation. Your Honor, I understand this is unusual, but I've done the research. I've prepared for this case as thoroughly as any lawyer would. My client deserves a fair defense. Judge Grayson's smirk widened. Miss Carter, this is a court of law, not a stage for theatrics. Do you even realize the seriousness of what you're attempting? I do, Amelia said quickly, her voice unwavering. And I also realize that my client's life could be ruined if they don't have someone fighting for them. A murmur of agreement rippled through the courtroom. Even some of the attorneys who had initially dismissed her were now looking at her with a hint of respect. Judge Grayson frowned, clearly displeased with the shift in tone. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat, drawing attention back to himself. Your Honor, while I agree that the situation is unconventional, I believe it's only fair to hear Miss Carter out. After all, the law is meant to ensure justice, not suppress it. Judge Grayson's frown deepened. He looked from Mr. Hayes to Amelia and back again, weighing his options. Finally, he sighed and leaned forward. Fine, he said. Miss Carter, I'll allow you to continue, temporarily. But if I find that you're wasting this court's time, I will hold you in contempt. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor, Amelia replied, relief flooding her voice. She took a deep breath and prepared to continue her argument. Amelia hadn't always been this fearless. Just a year ago, she had been an ordinary teenager, more interested in hanging out with her friends than fighting legal battles. But everything changed the day her brother James was arrested. James had been Amelia's hero, smart, kind, and fiercely protective. He was only 2 months away from finishing law school when he got into a fight with a wealthy businessman outside a bar. The man claimed James had assaulted him, and despite James's insistence that it was self-defense, he was arrested and charged. Amelia's parents had tried to help, but they didn't have the resources to hire a top-notch attorney. The public defender assigned to James's case was overworked and uninterested, barely putting up a fight in court. In the end, James was convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison. Amelia had been devastated. Watching her brother, a man who had dedicated his life to justice, become a victim of the very system he believed in had shattered her faith in fairness. But instead of giving up, she decided to fight. She would learn the law herself, and she would find a way to make things right. Back in the courtroom, Amelia launched into her argument with renewed determination. Her voice was steady, her words precise as she laid out the evidence in her client's favor. The client, a middle-aged man named Mr. Peterson, sat beside her, looking both hopeful and terrified. He had been accused of embezzling funds from his employer, a charge he vehemently denied. Amelia presented documents proving discrepancies in the company's financial records, suggesting that someone else could have been responsible. She quoted legal precedents that supported her client's right to a thorough investigation. The courtroom listened intently. Even Judge Grayson, who leaned forward in his chair, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Amelia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she could do this. But then Mr. Hayes stood up. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm. "While Miss Carter's argument is impressive, it doesn't change the fact that she is not a licensed attorney. Allowing her to continue sets a dangerous precedent." The courtroom buzzed again, tension thick in the air. Judge Grayson looked at Amelia, his expression hard. "Miss Carter," he said, "I'll give you one last chance to explain yourself. Who gave you the authority to act as legal counsel in this case?" Amelia hesitated, her mind racing. She had prepared for this question, but now that it was here, her confidence wavered. She took a deep breath and opened her mouth to respond. But before she could speak, the door to the courtroom opened again. This time, it wasn't a suited professional who entered, but a young boy, no older than 10. "Oh, Amelia," the boy called out, his voice breaking the tense silence. Amelia turned, her eyes widening in shock. "Ethan," she whispered. The boy ran toward her, clutching a crumpled envelope in his hand. "You forgot this," he said, thrusting the envelope at her. Amelia stared at him, her heart pounding. She recognized the envelope immediately. It was something she had never intended to reveal, not here, not now. But with the entire courtroom watching, there was no way to avoid it. What was inside the envelope? And why did it matter so much? Amelia's hands shook as she took it from Ethan, the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on her. Her fingers trembled as she held the envelope tightly, almost as if she could make it disappear through sheer force of will. The courtroom was utterly silent, everyone straining to see what was so important about the crumpled paper in her hands. "Miss Carter," Judge Grayson said, his voice sharp. "What's in that envelope?" Amelia hesitated, her mind racing. The envelope contained something she had never planned to show anyone. Not here, not in front of a packed courtroom, and certainly not with Judge Grayson scrutinizing her every move. But Ethan, his innocence had brought it here, and now she had no choice but to address it. She started to speak, her voice faltering. "It's nothing that concerns this case, Your Honor." Judge Grayson's eyes narrowed. "Miss Carter, you're already walking a thin line. If you're withholding something pertinent to these proceedings, I assure you, it will not end well for you." Amelia swallowed hard. She could feel Ethan's small hand tugging at her sleeve, his wide eyes looking up at her with pure trust. "Show them, Amelia," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Her heart sank. The boy didn't understand the consequences of what he was asking her to do, but she couldn't blame him. He was just trying to help. She took a deep breath and glanced at her client, Mr. Peterson, whose expression was a mix of confusion and fear. Amelia's hands moved to open the envelope, but before she could, Daniel Hayes stepped forward again. "Your Honor," he interjected, his tone measured, "I think we're losing focus on the matter at hand. Miss Carter's possession of this envelope, whatever it contains, is irrelevant to her qualifications or lack thereof to represent a client," Daniel Hayes argued. The judge raised a hand, silencing Mr. Hayes. "I'll be the one to determine what's relevant here." Amelia took a deep breath, steeling herself. If she revealed what was in the envelope, it could derail everything. But if she refused, Judge Grayson would likely hold her in contempt. The weight of the decision bore down on her, and for a moment, she felt completely alone. "Miss Carter," the judge said again, his voice now a low warning. "I won't ask you again. Open the envelope." Amelia's gaze flicked to Ethan, then to Mr. Peterson, and finally back to the judge. With no other options, she slowly tore open the top of the envelope and pulled out its contents. Inside was a letter, handwritten in her brother James's neat, meticulous script. Amelia's throat tightened as she unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words she knew by heart. The letter was a plea, James's final message to her before he was taken to prison. It was filled with encouragement, hope, and a challenge to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, no matter how impossible it seemed. Amelia's hands trembled as she held the letter, unsure of what to do next. The courtroom waited, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "What is it, Miss Carter?" Judge Grayson asked, his voice softer now, almost curious. Amelia hesitated, then folded the letter and tucked it back into the envelope. "It's personal," she said firmly, meeting the judge's gaze. "And it has nothing to do with this case." For a moment, Judge Grayson said nothing. The room was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Finally, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Fine," he said. "But understand this, Miss Carter, this is your last chance. Any further disruptions, and I'll have no choice but to remove you from this courtroom." Amelia nodded, relief washing over her. She glanced at Ethan and gave him a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you," she whispered, ruffling his hair. "You can go sit with Lily now." Ethan nodded and scampered to the back of the courtroom, where Amelia's best friend, Lily, sat watching anxiously. Amelia turned back to face the judge, ready to continue her argument. But before she could speak, the courtroom doors burst open once again. This time, it wasn't a child or a lawyer who entered. It was a tall, stern-looking woman in a dark blazer, her hair pulled back into a tight bun. She carried herself with authority, and her sharp eyes scanned the room as she strode forward. "Your Honor," the woman said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife, "my name is Margaret Steele. I'm with the District Attorney's Office, and I'm here to address a matter of great importance." Judge Grayson frowned. "Miss Steele, this is highly irregular. What matter could possibly justify interrupting my courtroom?" Miss Steele's gaze shifted to Amelia, her expression unreadable. "It concerns the unauthorized presence of this individual," she said, gesturing toward Amelia, "and the consequences of allowing her to continue." The courtroom erupted into chaos once again. Amelia's stomach dropped as she realized that Miss Steele wasn't here to support her. She was here to tear her down. "Order!" Judge Grayson shouted, banging his gavel. "Miss Steele, you will explain yourself." "Now." Miss Steele nodded. "Of course, Your Honor. I've come to inform this court that if Miss Carter is allowed to proceed, it will constitute a serious violation of legal ethics. As a representative of the District Attorney's Office, it is my duty to ensure that the integrity of this court is upheld." Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. She had fought so hard to get here, and now it felt like the entire system was conspiring to stop her. But she couldn't give up, not when so much was at stake. "Your Honor," she said, her voice strong despite the fear bubbling inside her, "I respectfully request the chance to prove myself. I may not have a law degree, but I've done the work. I've studied the law, and I believe I'm the best person to defend my client." Judge Grayson looked at her, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Miss Steele, then at Mr. Hayes, and finally at the packed courtroom. The tension in the room was palpable, everyone holding their breath as they waited for his decision. Finally, Judge Grayson spoke. "I'll allow this hearing to continue," he said, his tone firm. "But, Miss Carter, you are now on very thin ice. If you falter even once, I won't hesitate to shut this down. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Your Honor," Amelia said, relief filling her voice. But her relief was short-lived. Miss Steele stepped forward again, a smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. "In that case, Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness." Amelia's blood ran cold. Witness? What witness? She hadn't been prepared for this. As Miss Steele turned toward the door, the courtroom watched in stunned silence. A man entered, a man Amelia recognized instantly. It was the businessman who had accused her brother, James. Amelia froze, her mind reeling. Why was he here? What did he have to do with this case? And, more importantly, what was Miss Steele planning to do next? The room felt as though it had been drained of air. Amelia's stomach twisted as she watched the businessman saunter into the courtroom, dressed in a tailored navy suit. He carried himself with the same arrogance that had haunted her since James's trial. His presence here wasn't just unexpected, it was a threat. He glanced at her, his lips curling into a smirk that made her skin crawl. Miss Steele gestured toward him. Your Honor, this is Mr. Victor Grant. He is a key witness, and his testimony is crucial to establishing why this court cannot allow Miss Carter to continue her representation. Amelia's heart pounded as questions raced through her mind. What could Victor Grant possibly have to say about her? How could Miss Steele connect him to this case? Judge Grayson frowned. Mr. Grant's presence is highly irregular, he said, his tone skeptical. Explain, Miss Steele, why this man's testimony is relevant to these proceedings. With respect, Your Honor, Miss Steele began. Mr. Grant has valuable insight into Miss Carter's background and motivations. His testimony will reveal the underlying issues that make her unsuitable to act as legal counsel, even in an unconventional capacity. Amelia's palms grew sweaty. This was an ambush, plain and simple. She glanced at Mr. Peterson, her client, who looked at her with growing unease. She needed to act quickly, but she couldn't show how rattled she was. Your Honor, Amelia said, stepping forward, I object to this witness. His testimony has no bearing on the facts of this case. Judge Grayson raised a hand to silence her. Miss Carter, I'll decide what's relevant. Mr. Grant, take the stand. Victor Grant moved to the witness stand, his smirk never fading as he was sworn in. Amelia's thoughts raced. She had studied every angle of Mr. Peterson's case, but this was entirely unexpected. She needed to stay focused, but the sight of Grant, the man who had destroyed her brother's future, made her blood boil. Miss Steele began her questioning. Mr. Grant, can you describe your prior interactions with Miss Carter? Grant's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. Of course, he said smoothly. I first encountered Miss Carter during her brother's trial. He was convicted of assaulting me after a heated altercation outside a bar. The evidence was clear, and the court found him guilty. The courtroom murmured. Amelia's face burned as she clenched her fists. Grant wasn't just dredging up the past. He was twisting it to suit his narrative. And how did Miss Carter behave during that time? Miss Steele asked, her voice dripping with false concern. She was disruptive, Grant said, his tone feigning innocence. She attended every hearing, glaring at me like I was some kind of villain. Even after the trial, she wouldn't let it go. She sent letters, made phone calls, trying to reopen the case. It was obsessive. Amelia took a step forward. Your Honor, this has nothing to do with Mr. Peterson's case. This is an attempt to discredit me personally. Judge Grayson gave her a sharp look. Miss Carter, you will have your turn to respond. Sit down. Reluctantly, Amelia obeyed, her mind churning. Grant's words stung, not because they were entirely false, but because they were being used against her. Yes, she had fought for James after his conviction. She had written letters, made phone calls. But it wasn't out of obsession. It was out of love. Out of a desperate need to prove her brother's innocence. Miss Steele continued. Mr. Grant, in your opinion, does Miss Carter's behavior during her brother's trial suggest she is fit to represent a client in a legal setting? Absolutely not, Grant said, shaking his head. She's emotionally unstable and has no respect for the legal system. Allowing her to act as counsel is not only inappropriate, but dangerous. The words hit Amelia like a punch to the gut. She gripped the edges of the defendant's table, struggling to keep her composure. She wanted to scream, to call Grant a liar, to remind everyone that he was the one who had destroyed her family. But she couldn't let him see her break. Miss Steele turned to the judge. Your Honor, this testimony demonstrates exactly why Miss Carter should not be allowed to continue. Her actions during her brother's trial show a clear lack of professionalism and objectivity. She's unfit to represent anyone in court. Amelia shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is absurd. Mr. Grant is not a neutral party. He's the man who falsely accused. The courtroom erupted into murmurs again. Judge Grayson banged his gavel. Order. Miss Carter, you will conduct yourself appropriately, or I will hold you in contempt. Amelia took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady but firm, Mr. Grant's testimony is biased and irrelevant. If this court is truly interested in justice, then I respectfully request the opportunity to cross-examine him. The judge hesitated, clearly torn. Finally, he nodded. Very well, Miss Carter. You may proceed. Amelia stepped forward, her heart pounding. This was her chance to turn the tables, but it wouldn't be easy. Grant was a skilled manipulator, and he had the backing of Miss Steele. She needed to be sharp, focused, and fearless. Mr. Grant, she began, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. You claim that my actions during my brother's trial were disruptive. Can you provide specific examples? Grant smirked. I don't have to. Everyone in that courtroom saw how you behaved. That's not an answer, Amelia said calmly. If you're going to accuse me of being disruptive, then you need to provide evidence. Otherwise, your testimony is just opinion. Grant's smirk faltered slightly. Fine. You were loud, argumentative, and refused to accept the court's decision. And do you believe those actions motivated by a desire to fight for my brother's innocence, make me incapable of defending my client today? Yes, Grant said bluntly. You're too emotional to handle a case like this. Amelia's eyes narrowed. Too emotional, or too determined to let people like you exploit the system for your own gain? The courtroom gasped. Judge Grayson leaned forward. Miss Carter, watch your tone. Amelia nodded, but her gaze never left Grant. Mr. Grant, let's talk about the evidence in my brother's case, specifically, the security footage from the bar. Do you recall why it was never admitted in court? Grant's face darkened. It was ruled inadmissible. Why? Amelia pressed, her voice sharpening. Was it because it contradicted your claim of assault? Grant shifted uncomfortably. I'm not here to discuss your brother's case. Amelia took a step closer. No, you're here to discredit me. But if we're going to question my credibility, then we need to question yours too. The tension in the room was palpable. Grant opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a loud crash came from the back of the courtroom. Everyone turned to see what had happened. A man stood in the doorway, his face pale, his breathing labored. He held up a USB drive, his hand shaking. I have evidence, he said, his voice trembling. Evidence that proves everything she's saying is true. The courtroom erupted into chaos once again. Amelia froze, her heart racing. Who was this man? What evidence did he have? And, more importantly, how was it connected to her case? The man in the doorway stumbled forward, clutching the USB drive like it was a lifeline. His disheveled suit and haunted eyes suggested he had been wrestling with a decision for some time, and had finally made it. Judge Grayson pounded his gavel, his voice booming. Order in the court. Who are you? And what is the meaning of this interruption? The man stopped, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. My name is Henry Willis, he said, his voice shaky but loud enough to carry through the room. I used to work for Victor Grant. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Victor Grant's face turned pale, the smug confidence he had displayed earlier vanishing in an instant. He stood up abruptly, his voice sharp. Your Honor, I object to this man's intrusion. He has no business here. Judge Grayson's gaze shifted between Willis and Grant, his brow furrowed. Mr. Willis, you've disrupted my courtroom. This better be important. Willis nodded quickly, holding up the USB drive. Your Honor, I have evidence that contradicts Mr. Grant's testimony. It's footage from the night of the incident involving Amelia's brother. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. Footage? The security footage that had been withheld during James's trial. Her hands gripped the edge of the defendant's table, her knuckles turning white. Victor Grant's voice was laced with anger. This is outrageous. That footage was deemed inadmissible years ago. It's irrelevant now. Willis's voice grew stronger. It wasn't inadmissible, it was suppressed. By you, Mr. Grant. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Judge Grayson banged his gavel repeatedly, his patience clearly wearing thin. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. Amelia's heart raced as she looked at Willis. She didn't know who he was or why he was coming forward now, but she could feel the tides turning. This was her chance, not just to defend Mr. Peterson, but to uncover the truth about her brother's case. Judge Grayson turned to Willis, his expression stern. Mr. Willis, do you have any proof to support these claims? Willis nodded, holding up the USB drive again. It's all here, Your Honor. The footage, along with records showing how it was deliberately suppressed. Grant's face twisted in fury. Your Honor, this man is lying. He's a disgruntled former employee trying to settle a personal vendetta. Amelia stood, her voice steady but urgent. Your Honor, if this evidence is genuine, it could prove that my brother was wrongfully convicted. And it could also. All this time, Amelia's gaze flicked to Willis, searching for answers in his tense expression. Meanwhile, Judge Grayson rubbed his temples, clearly exasperated. This case is about Mr. Peterson, not your brother, Miss Carter. However, If there's evidence that speaks to the credibility of a key witness, it must be considered. Grant's jaw clenched. This is a farce, Your Honor. I demand you throw this man out and strike his claims from the record. Judge Grayson ignored him. He turned to the bailiff. Retrieve the drive and have it reviewed by our IT specialist. We'll determine its authenticity. The bailiff walked over to Willis, took the USB drive, and handed it to the judge. Then, without a word, he left the courtroom to deliver it for review. The tension in the room was suffocating. All eyes were on Grant, who now looked less like the confident accuser and more like a man cornered. As the courtroom waited for the footage to be reviewed, Amelia's mind churned with possibilities. If the footage was real, it could vindicate her brother and expose Victor Grant for the fraud he was. But one question remained. Why had Willis come forward now, after all this time? Something inaudible over the bar's noise. Amelia's breath caught as she watched. This was it. She glanced at Mr. Peterson, who was watching the scene unfold with a mix of confusion and hope. I'm sorry this is getting so complicated, she whispered. He gave her a small smile. Don't apologize. You're fighting harder for me than anyone else ever has. Amelia's chest tightened at his words. She hadn't expected to feel so connected to Mr. Peterson's plight. He reminded her of James, falsely accused, with the odds stacked against him. She resolved to keep fighting, no matter what. After what felt like an eternity, the bailiff returned, handing a laptop to the judge. Your Honor, he said, the footage is authentic. It hasn't been tampered with. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. Judge Grayson nodded and looked at the bailiff. Play the footage. The laptop screen was turned toward the court, and the bailiff clicked play. The grainy black and white video flickered to life, showing the bar on the night of the altercation. Victor Grant was there, sitting at a table with several associates, laughing and drinking. Moments later, James entered the frame, calm and composed. He approached Grant, said something inaudible over the bar's noise. Slowly, his expression unreadable. Understood, Your Honor. The weight of the moment pressed down on the courtroom. James hadn't been the aggressor. He had been defending himself. Amelia's fingers curled into fists as she blinked back the sting of tears. This was the truth, the proof she had been fighting for all along. She turned to look at Grant. His face was a deep shade of red, his jaw tight. He knew he was caught. The footage ended, and the room fell into stunned silence. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. Mr. Grant, he said, his voice cold. Care to explain this? Grant stammered, his confidence crumbling. Your Honor, I don't know what this man is trying to pull, but... Judge Grayson cut him off. That's enough. This court will not tolerate perjury or obstruction of justice. His gaze shifted to Daniel Hayes. Mr. Hayes, I suggest you reevaluate the value of this witness's testimony. Hayes, who had remained silent throughout the chaos, nodded slowly. Understood, Your Honor. The courtroom held its breath, waiting for what would come next. Slowly, Hayes nodded. Understood, Your Honor. Amelia stepped forward, her voice strong. Your Honor, this evidence not only discredits Mr. Grant, but it also calls into question the integrity of his accusations against my brother. I request that this court take his testimony with extreme caution moving forward. Judge Grayson nodded. Duly noted, Miss Carter. But let me remind you, this case is about Mr. Peterson. Keep your focus on defending your client. Yes, Your Honor, Amelia said, though her mind was already racing with possibilities. If she could bring this evidence to light, it might not only save Mr. Peterson, but also reopen her brother's case. As the courtroom settled, Miss Steele stood, her expression steely. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to regroup in light of this new evidence. Judge Grayson sighed and glanced at the clock. Fine. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. As the courtroom emptied, Amelia sat down heavily, her head spinning. She had won this battle, but the war was far from over. She couldn't shake the feeling that Miss Steele and Grant weren't done yet. Stared at the empty witness stand, her thoughts still racing. Henry Willis, she murmured. He said he used to work for Grant. But I don't know why he came forward now. Lily frowned. You think he's legit? Amelia exhaled sharply. I don't know. But that footage was real, and it changes everything. Lily nodded, glancing toward the courtroom doors. Still, you need to be careful. People like Grant don't just roll over. If he and Miss Steele have something else up their sleeves, you need to be ready. Amelia's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "I know," she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "And whatever they throw at me next, I'll be ready." Unfounded but driven by ulterior motives. Judge Grayson nodded, motioning for her to proceed. Amelia turned to face the jury, drawing in a slow breath to steady herself. "Let's revisit the key points of this case," she continued. "The prosecution has relied heavily on witness testimony. Testimony that we now know is unreliable. We've seen how Mr. Grant's statements contradict hard evidence, and if a key witness has been proven dishonest, how can we trust any part of their case?" Miss Steele folded her arms, her expression unreadable, but Amelia could see the tension in her stance. She wasn't happy. Furthermore, Amelia pressed on, "I will prove that Mr. Peterson had neither the means nor the motive to commit the crime he's accused of." The prosecution's entire argument is built on speculation, not fact. And in this court, speculation is not enough to convict a man. A murmur rippled through the room. Amelia could feel the shift, the weight of doubt settling in. She had momentum now, and she wasn't about to let go. She turned back to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, at this time, I would like to call my next witness." Around the courtroom, her mind racing. She had been prepared for Miss Steele to retaliate. But this was unexpected. Keeping her posture firm, she took a steady breath. "Your Honor," Amelia said, her voice controlled, "I request a moment to review these documents before responding." Judge Grayson looked up, his eyes sharp. "Make it quick, Miss Carter." Amelia took the folder, flipping through the pages with precise focus. If these emails were authentic, they could pose a serious threat to Mr. Peterson's defense. But something felt off. The language, the timestamps. There was a pattern here, and she needed to find it before Miss Steele could use it to bury her client. By an anonymous whistleblower from Mr. Peterson's company, Miss Steele stated, her tone crisp. Amelia's grip tightened on the papers. "Anonymous. Convenient." "Your Honor," she said, choosing her words carefully. "If these emails were obtained from an undisclosed source, we have no way of verifying their authenticity without a proper forensic analysis. Given the severity of the accusations, I request an independent digital forensic expert to examine these files before they are entered into evidence." Judge Grayson studied her for a long moment before shifting his gaze to Miss Steele. "Miss Steele, can the prosecution verify the chain of custody for these emails?" Miss Steele hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Amelia saw it. And so did Judge Grayson. "Until their authenticity is confirmed," he ruled, "this evidence will not be admitted." A wave of relief washed over Amelia, but she knew better than to celebrate. The prosecution wouldn't go down without a fight, and neither would she. A steady hand on his. "Then we'll make them see the truth," she said, her voice unwavering. "This isn't over." Mr. Peterson exhaled shakily, nodding, though doubt still clouded his eyes. As the minutes stretched on, Amelia's mind raced through possibilities. If those emails were forged, then someone had gone to great lengths to set Mr. Peterson up. But why? And who had the power to fabricate evidence so convincingly? Lily appeared beside her, phone in hand. "I made a few calls," she whispered. "There's a cybersecurity expert who might be able to help analyze those emails faster than the court's expert." Amelia's pulse quickened. "Can we trust them?" Lily smirked. "If someone tampered with those emails, they'll find it." Amelia nodded. The fight wasn't over, not even close. With anger and desperation. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous," he barked. "This entire case has been manipulated from the start." Judge Grayson's gaze turned icy. "Sit down, Mr. Grant," he ordered. "You are not in charge here." Amelia remained composed, though inside, her pulse was racing. This was it. The moment the prosecution's case was unraveling before everyone's eyes. She turned to Mr. Peterson, whose expression was a mixture of shock and relief. Miss Steele clenched her jaw, regaining her composure. "Your Honor, I had no prior knowledge that these emails were fabricated," she said, her voice carefully measured. "The prosecution presented them in good faith based on the information provided to us." "Then perhaps," Amelia interjected smoothly, "we should investigate exactly who supplied them and why they wanted to frame my client." A fresh murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Grayson let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples before speaking. "This court takes the matter of falsified evidence very seriously. There will be an independent inquiry into how these documents came to be presented as legitimate. His sharp gaze flicked to Miss Steele. In the meantime, the credibility of this case is now severely compromised. Amelia felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She had fought tooth and nail for this, but she knew it wasn't over yet. Grant and Steele weren't going down without a fight, and she had to be ready for whatever came next. Order, he thundered. There will be order in this courtroom. The noise gradually subsided, though the tension remained thick. Amelia turned her gaze to the man who had just entered. His hands were shaking, but his voice remained firm. State your name for the record, Judge Grayson commanded. The man swallowed hard. Nathan Cole, he said. I used to work in the IT department at Mr. Grant's firm. Miss Steele shot to her feet. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. This man cannot just barge in and... Judge Grayson cut her off with a sharp look. Considering the severity of these allegations, I will allow him to speak. But be very careful, Mr. Cole, he warned. Perjury will not be tolerated. Nathan nodded. I understand, Your Honor, but I'm telling the truth. Victor Grant pressured me to fabricate those emails to frame Mr. Peterson. He told me exactly what to write, what timestamps to use, and how to make them look legitimate. Amelia stole a glance at Grant, whose face had gone deathly pale. His hands clenched into fists on the table. You expect us to believe this? Miss Steele snapped, though her usual confidence wavered. Where is your proof? Nathan took a deep breath and pulled a small recorder from his pocket. Right here. I recorded everything. The courtroom erupted once more. Amelia barely dared to breathe. This was it. The moment that could shatter Grant's entire web of lies. Judge Grayson's expression darkened. Bailiff, take that recorder and have its contents reviewed immediately. As the bailiff stepped forward, Grant suddenly stood, his chair scraping against the floor. His face contorted with fury. This is a setup, he bellowed. This is... Enough, the judge thundered. Mr. Grant, you are dangerously close to contempt of court. Grant's mouth opened, then snapped shut. He looked trapped. Amelia felt her pulse quicken. She had fought tirelessly for this. And now, the truth was finally clawing its way to the surface. Judge said, his piercing gaze locked onto the man at the stand. You claim you worked for Mr. Grant. In what capacity? William swallowed hard. I was his assistant. I handled emails, schedules, and other tasks as assigned. Other tasks? Amelia pressed, stepping forward. Are you saying that falsifying evidence was one of them? William hesitated, his fingers twitching. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he nodded. Yes, Victor Grant instructed me to fabricate those emails. He told me exactly what to write and how to make them seem authentic. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Grant's face darkened with rage, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. Miss Steele, for the first time, looked genuinely unsettled. You have proof of this? Judge Grayson asked, his voice edged with skepticism. William nodded quickly, pulling a small notebook from his pocket. I wrote everything down. Dates, instructions, even direct quotes from Mr. Grant. I kept copies of draft emails before they were finalized. The bailiff stepped forward to retrieve the notebook, handing it to the judge. Silence fell as Judge Grayson flipped through the pages, his expression tightening with each passing second. Finally, he looked up, his gaze sharp as a blade. Mr. Grant, he said coldly, do you have anything to say for yourself? Grant opened his mouth, then closed it, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his mind undoubtedly scrambling for a way out. But for the first time, there was no escape. Amelia inhaled deeply, steadying herself. This was it. The moment the truth finally won. Was already grappling with one deception, and now another layer had been added. The judge exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting between Tate and Grant. Mr. Tate, he said, his voice measured. Do you understand the severity of what you're admitting to? Tate nodded, gripping the edges of the witness stand. Yes, Your Honor. I know what I did was wrong, but I can't keep covering for him. Not anymore. Amelia clenched her fists beneath the table, her mind racing. This was the moment she had been fighting for, proof that the case against Mr. Peterson was built on lies. But something still felt off. Why confess now? And what else was lurking beneath the surface? Judge Grayson turned to the bailiff. Have this hard drive reviewed immediately. I want verification of its contents. The bailiff nodded and exited the courtroom, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Every eye was on Victor Grant, whose face had gone pale, his fury barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of control. "Mr. Grant," the judge said, his tone dangerously calm. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Tate swallowed hard, his fingers twisting together. He said if I ever spoke out, he'd ruin me. My career, my reputation, everything. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Amelia's jaw tightened. She had suspected intimidation, but hearing it confirmed sent a fresh wave of anger through her. She took a small step closer, keeping her voice steady. "But you're here now. Why take that risk?" Tate exhaled shakily. "Because I couldn't keep living with the guilt. And because I know what happens to people who cross Victor Grant. I had to speak before it was too late." Amelia let the weight of his words settle over the courtroom. She could feel the shift. People were starting to see the truth. She straightened. "No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Grayson gave a curt nod. "Very well. We will proceed cautiously as we verify the evidence." Amelia returned to her seat, her heart pounding. This fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt the tides turning in her favor. Hallway. Their faces a mix of excitement and disbelief. Lily let out a low whistle. "I can't believe it. You actually got him." Amelia shook her head, her expression wary. "Not yet, but we're close." Ethan tugged at her sleeve, his wide eyes filled with admiration. "You're gonna win, right?" She gave him a small, tired smile. "I'm going to make sure the truth comes out, no matter what." Lily folded her arms. "I don't think Grant's done fighting. People like him don't go down without a struggle." Amelia exhaled, glancing back toward the courtroom doors. "I know. But now, for the first time, he's the one on defense." The weight of the moment settled over them. The battle wasn't over, but the scales had finally started to tip in their favor. "Here's your toned-up paragraph with the same content, but a stronger, more polished flow." "Hallway, you were amazing in there," Lily said, her voice low. Tate's confession was a total mic drop. Amelia smiled faintly, exhaustion starting to seep in. "It's not over yet. Steele's still got cards to play, and Grant's not going down without a fight." Ethan tugged on her sleeve. "Are you scared?" She looked at him, her expression softening. "Sometimes, doing the right thing means being scared, and doing it anyway." When the court reconvened, the atmosphere was tense. The forensic analyst returned with a report on the hard drive, confirming its contents as genuine. It detailed a trail of emails, payments, and instructions, all linking Victor Grant to the fabricated evidence. Judge Grayson's face was grim as he addressed Grant. "Mr. Grant, this court is deeply troubled by the evidence presented. You are hereby detained for further investigation into your conduct. Bailiffs, take him into custody." The courtroom gasped as the officers approached Grant. He stood abruptly, his face contorted with anger. "You'll regret this," he hissed, glaring at Amelia. "You think it's refined for better readability and impact while keeping everything intact. Send the next one when you're ready. Here's your toned-up version with the same content, but a stronger, more polished flow. You've won." "This isn't over," Grant spat. Amelia held his gaze, refusing to flinch. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the realization that his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. The bailiffs escorted him out, and the courtroom began to settle. Miss Steele stood, her expression steely. "Your Honor, while this development is significant, it does not absolve the defendant. The charges against Mr. Peterson still stand." Amelia rose to her feet. "Your Honor, with respect, every piece of evidence against my client has been discredited. The prosecution's case is built on lies, and it's clear Mr. Peterson was framed." Judge Grayson nodded slowly. "I agree. Based on the evidence presented, the charges against Mr. Peterson are hereby dismissed." The words hit Amelia like a wave of relief. She turned to Mr. Peterson, who looked stunned. "You're free," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "It's over." But even as the courtroom erupted into cheers, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that Grant's parting words were more than just empty threats. Something told her, this battle wasn't over yet. The courthouse buzzed with celebration as the charges against Mr. Peterson were officially dismissed. Outside, reporters flooded the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward as they vied for statements. Amelia, exhausted but triumphant, stepped into the sunlight with Mr. Peterson beside her. "You saved my life," he said, his voice trembling with gratitude. I don't know how I can ever thank you. Amelia smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. You don't have to. Just live your life and take care of the people who matter to you. He nodded, tears shining in his eyes. You're going to be an incredible lawyer someday. The praise felt good, but Amelia's mind was already racing ahead. Grant's final words echoed in her head. This isn't over. She knew they weren't just a parting shot. Men like him didn't give up easily, and she suspected he had more tricks up his sleeve. At the edge of the crowd, Lily and Ethan waited, their faces lit with excitement. Amelia, Lily shouted. It's now smoother and more engaging while preserving everything you wrote. Keep them coming. Here's your toned-up version, keeping everything intact but refining the flow and impact. Waving her arms, Lily grinned. You're famous now? Look at all these reporters. Amelia laughed, though she could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her. Let's get out of here, she said. I need a break. Later that evening, Amelia sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, flipping through her brother's old law books. The victory in court felt like a dream now, distant and surreal. But her mind kept drifting back to the bigger picture. Grant's arrest was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough. James was still in prison, his wrongful conviction casting a shadow over her triumph. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Lily. Hey, Amelia said, answering the call. What's up? Lily's voice was hurried, almost frantic. Amelia, have you seen the news? No, Amelia said, frowning. Why? Turn it on. Now. Amelia grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. The screen lit up with a breaking news banner. The anchor's voice was calm, but the content of her report made Amelia's blood run cold. Breaking news tonight. Victor Grant, who was detained earlier today on charges of fabricating evidence, but has been released on bail. Sources indicate that his legal team is preparing to mount a vigorous defense, claiming the allegations against him are part of a smear campaign orchestrated by his former employees. Amelia's jaw tightened. Released on bail? Already? Amelia, are you hearing this? Lily's voice crackled through the phone. He's not going down without a fight. I know, Amelia said, her mind racing. He's trying to flip the narrative, make himself the victim. It's exactly what I expected. What are you going to do? Lily asked. Amelia stared at the TV, her resolve hardening. I'm going to fight. He's not getting away with this. The next morning, Amelia woke early and headed to the local library. She knew that taking down someone like Grant required more than just determination. It required evidence. Real, undeniable evidence that couldn't be spun or dismissed. She pored over public records, financial documents, and anything else she could find that might expose his deeper wrongdoings. Hours passed, and the library began to empty as the sun set. Amelia's eyes burned from staring at the screen, but she refused to stop. Just as she was about to call it a night, something caught her eye, a series of payments made to an obscure consulting firm. The amounts were large, irregular, and suspiciously aligned with key dates in James's trial. Amelia's heart raced. The consulting firm's name wasn't familiar, but the pattern was unmistakable. She jotted down every detail, her mind spinning with possibilities. Was this the missing link? Could this tie Grant to the suppression of evidence in James's case? Her exhaustion forgotten, she decided to dig deeper. As she scrolled through more records, a name appeared that made her pause. Henry Willis, the same man who had brought the USB drive to court. His name was listed as a former employee of the consulting firm. Amelia leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. Willis wasn't just a random whistleblower. He was connected to Grant's operation. If she could get him to talk, really talk, she might finally. Amelia had the evidence she needed to exonerate James. The following day, she tracked down Willis. He lived in a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, the building worn and unassuming. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding. After a long moment, the door creaked open, and Willis peeked out, his eyes wary. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice low. It's not safe. I need your help, Amelia said, her tone pleading. You came forward in court, but there's more to this, isn't there? You know things about Grant, things that could clear my brother's name. Willis hesitated, his expression conflicted. You don't understand. People like Grant don't just let things go. If I say too much, I'll be next. I'll protect you, Amelia said firmly. You did the right thing once. Do it again, and we can take him down for good. Willis sighed, rubbing his temples. You don't get it, kid. This goes deeper than you think. Grant's just the tip of the iceberg. There are people behind him, powerful people. They'll do whatever it takes to keep their secrets buried. Amelia's stomach twisted. Here's your paragraph. Toned up while keeping everything intact. Twisted, but she refused to back down. If we don't fight them, they'll keep doing this. Innocent people like my brother will keep paying the price. Willis looked at her, something shifting in his expression. He seemed to weigh her words, his shoulders sagging as if under an invisible weight. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said quietly. But if we do this, you need to be ready. Once we start pulling at these threads, there's no going back. I'm ready, Amelia said, her voice steady. Willis stepped aside, letting her into the apartment. All right, he said, closing the door behind her. Let's get to work. As Amelia and Willis began to unravel the web of corruption surrounding Victor Grant, the stakes grew higher. Each piece of evidence they uncovered led to more questions and more danger. Amelia knew she was walking a fine line, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the truth was finally within reach. And then, one night, as she returned home from another late meeting with Willis, she found her apartment door ajar. Her heart sank. Dread pooled in her stomach as she pushed the door open slowly, her pulse pounding in her ears. Inside, the apartment was ransacked, papers scattered, furniture overturned, drawers yanked open. Her laptop was missing. On the kitchen table, a single note sat. Its words were scrawled in bold, menacing letters. Stay out of this, or you'll regret it. Amelia's blood ran cold. Grant's words from the courtroom replayed in her mind. This isn't over. He was coming for her. And he wasn't playing fair. She stared at the note, her hands trembling as a mixture of fear and anger coursed through her. Taking a deep breath, she tried to steady herself. Whoever had broken into her apartment had sent a clear message. Stop digging or face the consequences. But if they thought a scare tactic would make her back down, they didn't know her. She grabbed her phone and dialed Lily. Lily, she said, her voice shaking. Someone broke into my apartment. What? Lily's voice shot up in alarm. Are you okay? Where are you now? I'm fine, Amelia said, though her heart was still racing. I just got home, and everything's trashed. They took my laptop. Lily's voice softened. Amelia, you need to call the police. Amelia hesitated. I don't know. What if they can't do anything? What if this just escalates things? You can't handle this alone, Lily said firmly. Promise me you'll at least tell someone. Amelia sighed. Okay, I'll call. The police arrived within the hour. 2 officers surveyed the damage, their faces grim as Amelia explained the situation. She handed them the note, watching as one of the officers bagged it as evidence. Do you have any idea who might have done this? The officer asked. Amelia hesitated. She didn't want to reveal too much and risk tipping off Grant or his allies. I've been involved in a legal case, she said carefully. It's possible this is connected to that. The officer nodded, jotting down notes. We'll file a report and have our team look into it. In the meantime, I suggest staying somewhere else for a few days, just to be safe. Thanks, Amelia said, though she knew she couldn't afford to slow down. If anything, this attack only reinforced her resolve. The next morning, Amelia met with Henry Willis in a quiet diner, far from her usual haunts. She hadn't told him about the break-in over the phone, fearing their calls might be monitored. When she explained what had happened, his face darkened. This is exactly what I warned you about, Willis said, his voice low. Grant's people don't play fair. If they're willing to break into your apartment, they're willing to do worse. I'm not scared of them, Amelia said, though she felt a pang of doubt. We're too close to the truth to stop now. Willis shook his head. You don't get it. It's not just Grant. There's an entire network of people behind him, politicians, executives, even law enforcement. They all have something to lose if we expose this. Amelia leaned forward, her eyes blazing. Then we expose all of them. We've got the hard drive, and we know there's more out there. If we can gather enough evidence, they won't be able to silence us. Willis sighed, rubbing his temples. You've got guts, kid, I'll give you that. But guts won't protect you if they decide you're too much of a threat. Amelia mulled over the note, the violation of her safe space, the weight of what she was up against. But then she thought of James, locked in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit. She thought of Mr. Peterson, whose life had been nearly destroyed. She couldn't walk away. Not now. What's the next step? She asked, her voice steady. Willis hesitated, then slid a folder across the table. This is everything I've got on the consulting firm. If we can trace the money, we'll find the people pulling the strings. Amelia opened the folder and scanned the documents. Bank transfers, invoices, internal memos. Each piece fit into a larger puzzle, a web of corruption beginning to take shape. Her mind raced as she connected the dots. This is huge, she murmured, barely above a whisper. If we can prove this. It's not enough, Willis cut in. We need more concrete evidence. Something that directly ties these people to their crimes. Amelia nodded. Then we'll find it. Later that evening, she returned to Lily's apartment, where she had decided to stay. For the time being, Lily greeted her at the door, her face etched with worry. You look exhausted, she said, pulling Amelia inside. You've been running yourself into the ground. I don't have a choice, Amelia murmured, sinking onto the couch. If we don't move fast, Grant and his people will bury everything. Lily sat beside her, pressing a warm cup of tea into her hands. Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? I don't want to lose you. Amelia offered a faint smile. I promise. A few nights later, Amelia and Willis made their move. Armed with the information from the folder, they infiltrated an office building owned by the consulting firm. The plan was risky: find the files, copy them, and get out before anyone noticed. The building was eerily quiet as they slipped inside, the dim glow of emergency lights guiding their way. Willis led them to a small server room, his hands steady despite the tension crackling in the air. This is it, he whispered, pulling out a flash drive. Watch the door. Amelia nodded, her heart pounding as she kept an eye on the hallway. The minutes dragged by, each one stretching tighter than the last. A way out. The seconds stretched into eternity. Finally, Willis let out a quiet exclamation of triumph. Got it, he said, pocketing the flash drive. Let's go. But as they turned to leave, the sharp echo of footsteps filled the hallway. Amelia's stomach dropped. Two security guards emerged from the darkness, their flashlights slicing through the dim corridor. Hey, stop right there, one of them shouted. Amelia and Willis froze, their minds racing. They had been caught. And now, the stakes had just risen to a dangerous new level. The guards closed in, their beams glaring like spotlights. Amelia's breath hitched as she glanced at Willis, who looked just as frozen. Her mind reeled, grasping for an escape plan. Getting caught now meant losing everything they had risked so much to uncover. Stay calm, Willis whispered under his breath, though his trembling hands betrayed his nerves. Hands where we can see them, one of the guards barked, stepping closer. Amelia slowly raised her hands, her heartbeat a relentless drum against her ribs. She exchanged a glance with Willis, her eyes pleading for a way out. You're really working for? An idea, any idea. But before either of them could speak, one of the guards reached for his radio. This is Team A, he said. We've got 2 intruders on the 2nd floor, requesting backup. The second guard stepped forward, flashlight cutting through the darkness. Move. Both of you. You're coming with us. Amelia's pulse quickened. If they were taken in, their mission was over. They had to act now. Wait, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. We can explain. The guards exchanged skeptical looks. Explain what? One of them scoffed. You're trespassing. Amelia nodded quickly, trying to buy time. You're right. And we'll go with you. But first, I need to show you something. It's on that flash drive. Willis shot her a startled look, but she ignored him. The guards hesitated, caught off guard by her calm demeanor. Look, she pressed, her tone urgent. What's on that drive could save your jobs, maybe even your lives. But only if you see it before you call for backup. One of the guards frowned. What kind of game are you playing? No games, Amelia said, lowering her voice. Do you know who? We didn't see you, he said. Do you know who you work for? Do you know what they're hiding? The guards exchanged uneasy glances. Amelia pressed on, sensing a crack in their resolve. You've seen things, haven't you? Things that don't add up. This drive has the proof. Just give us 5 minutes. If you still think we're lying, we'll go quietly. The first guard's flashlight wavered. You've got 2 minutes, he said gruffly. But if this is some kind of trick. It's not, Amelia cut in quickly. She handed the flash drive to Willis, who inserted it into his laptop with shaking hands. The guards leaned in as the screen lit up, revealing a series of incriminating files, emails detailing bribes, invoices for fabricated evidence, wire transfers to offshore accounts. Their faces darkened as they scrolled through the files. This is real, one of them muttered. Amelia nodded. That's why we're here. If this gets out, the people behind it will try to bury us, and you. But if we work together, we can stop them. The guards exchanged a long, uncertain look. Finally, the first one sighed. We didn't see you, he said. Someone with real power. Step back. But you need to leave, now. Thank you, Amelia said, her voice filled with relief. She and Willis packed up quickly, the tension still thick in the air as they slipped out of the building. A rush of adrenaline and gratitude surged through Amelia. They had narrowly escaped, but the evidence they had gathered could change everything. Back at Lily's apartment, Amelia and Willis reviewed the files in detail. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of the corruption at the heart of Victor Grant's operations. But as they pieced it together, a darker truth began to emerge. This isn't just about Grant, Willis said, his voice grim. He's part of something much bigger. These accounts, these payments, they trace back to major corporations and even politicians. Amelia's stomach turned. She had expected corruption, but not on this scale. What do we do with this? She asked. If we go public, they'll come after us. Willis hesitated, then nodded. We need to find someone who can protect us and expose this at the same time. Someone with real power. The next day, Amelia reached out to, her voice steady, an investigative journalist, one Amelia had read about in one of James's old law books. Her name was Sarah Green, a fearless reporter known for taking down high-profile criminals. Amelia sent her an encrypted email, detailing what they had found and asking for a meeting. To her surprise, Sarah responded within hours. The meeting was set for that evening at a discreet cafe downtown. Amelia and Willis arrived early, nerves on edge. When Sarah walked in, her presence was commanding. Leather jacket, laptop bag slung over her shoulder, sharp eyes scanning the room before she approached their table. You must be Amelia, Sarah said, sliding into the seat. And you're Mr. Willis. Let's see what you've got. Willis handed over the flash drive, and Sarah plugged it into her laptop. As she reviewed the files, her expression grew more intense. This is huge, she said finally, looking up at them. If this is all verified, it could bring down some of the most powerful people in the country. Amelia nodded. That's why we need your help. We can't do this alone. Sarah leaned, and there was no turning back. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her gaze thoughtful. I can get this out to the public, but you need to be prepared for the fallout. People will come after you, hard. Are you ready for that? Amelia hesitated, glancing at Willis. He looked exhausted but determined. We're ready, she said. Sarah nodded. Then let's get to work. For the next week, Sarah worked tirelessly to verify the evidence and prepare her story. Amelia and Willis stayed in hiding, knowing that every step forward brought them closer to exposing the truth and closer to danger. One night, as Amelia sat by the window of Lily's apartment, her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. It's going live tomorrow. Be ready. Amelia's heart raced. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth about Victor Grant and the web of corruption he was part of. But as she stared at the text, a sense of foreboding crept over her. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Morning light filtered through the blinds as Amelia sat at the edge of the couch, staring at the screen of her phone. Sarah's story had gone live. Hearing this morning. No one knows where he is. At 7 a.m. sharp, the story went live, published across multiple platforms with a headline that made Amelia's heart pound. The hidden web, corruption, conspiracy, and the fight for justice. Within minutes, it went viral. News anchors dissected the evidence. Politicians issued panicked statements. Social media erupted with outrage. The article laid it all bare. Victor Grant's role, the falsified evidence, the consulting firm's shady dealings, and the broader network of corruption that reached deep into industries and government alike. Amelia felt a flicker of pride. This was what she and Willis had fought for. But the victory felt fleeting, overshadowed by a gnawing sense of dread. They had exposed the truth, but in doing so, they had painted targets on their backs. By noon, Amelia's phone buzzed. It was Sarah. Her tone was firm, urgent. Amelia, it's a firestorm. The DOJ is opening an investigation, and Grant's associates are already scrambling. But there's something you need to know. Amelia gripped the phone tightly. What is it? Grant's gone, Sarah said. He didn't show up to his scheduled court. No, I just don't like feeling like the prey instead of the hunter. Appearance this morning. Word is he skipped town. Amelia's chest tightened. Gone? How? I thought he was under surveillance. So did I, Sarah said, frustration lacing her voice. But someone helped him. I'm digging into it, but you need to be careful. If Grant's on the run, he might try to retaliate. Amelia swallowed hard. Thanks for letting me know. That evening, tension thickened the air in Lily's apartment. Willis paced the living room, hands shoved deep in his pockets. I told you this would happen, he muttered. Grant's too slippery to go down without a fight. He's probably planning his next move right now. Amelia sat quietly, her mind spinning. He's desperate, she said. That makes him dangerous. But it also makes him reckless. If he tries something, we'll be ready. Ready for what? Willis snapped. You think we can predict his next move? He's got resources, connections. He could do anything. Amelia looked up at him, her eyes steady. We've come too far to give up now. The truth is out there, and people are paying attention. That's what matters. Willis sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know. I just don't like feeling like the prey instead of the hunter. Trap? What if they just want to scare us into running? I hope you're right. The next day, the fallout from Sarah's article continued to ripple through the media. Protests erupted in front of government buildings, demanding accountability for the corruption detailed in the story. The Justice Department announced a task force to investigate the implicated corporations and officials. Amelia watched the coverage with a mix of hope and apprehension. The wheels of justice were turning, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. That evening, as she and Willis sat at the kitchen table reviewing documents, Lily burst into the apartment, her face pale. You need to see this, she said, holding up her phone. Amelia took it, her stomach sinking as she read the message Lily had received. A warning, sent from an anonymous number. Get out while you can. They know where you are. Who sent this? Amelia asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, Lily said. It came out of nowhere. Willis stood abruptly. We need to leave. Now. Amelia hesitated. What if it's a look like when this was over? But now? It's hard to imagine. Bluff? Amelia asked. Do you really want to take that chance? Willis's voice was sharp. She knew he was right. They packed what little they had and slipped out of the apartment under the cover of darkness, moving quickly and quietly. Willis had arranged for them to stay at a safe house owned by a friend, a small cabin in the woods, far from prying eyes. The cabin was quiet and secluded, but the tension between them was impossible to ignore. Amelia spent her days poring over news updates, trying to stay ahead of the situation. Willis, meanwhile, kept his phone close, always ready to leave at a moment's notice. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, Willis broke the silence. Do you ever think about what happens after this? He asked, his voice softer than usual. Amelia looked up from her laptop. After what? After Grant's gone. After the investigation. After the dust settles. Amelia sighed. I don't know. I just want James to be free. After that, I haven't really thought about it. Willis nodded, a distant look in his eyes. I used to think about it all the time. What life would look like if I hadn't gotten involved with Grant. But now, he trailed off, shaking his head. Now it feels like there's no way out. There is a way out, IA said firmly. We just have to keep fighting. Willis didn't respond, but the doubt in his eyes lingered. The next morning, Amelia woke to the sound of her phone buzzing. It was Sarah. Amelia, Sarah said, her tone urgent. We've got a lead on Grant. He's holed up in a private estate outside the city. Word is he's meeting with some of his associates to plan his next move. Amelia's heart raced. Do you think he's trying to flee the country? It's possible, Sarah said. But we can't let him. If he gets away, everything we've worked for could fall apart. What can we do? Amelia asked. I've got a contact in law enforcement, Sarah said. If you're willing to testify about what you know, we might be able to get a warrant to raid the estate. Amelia hesitated. Testifying would put her directly in the crosshairs, but it might also be the only way to bring Grant down for good. I'll do it, she said finally. The next few hours. Firm, unwavering. She refused to look away. This was the moment they had fought for, the moment Grant finally faced justice. The past few hours had passed in a blur. Sarah's contact, a determined federal agent named Detective Ramirez, had met with Amelia to review her testimony. By the end of the day, a warrant was issued, and a raid was planned for dawn. As Amelia prepared for what was to come, a strange sense of calm settled over her. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to let fear stop her. Not now. Not ever. When the sun rose the next morning, Amelia stood with Sarah and Detective Ramirez outside the estate, watching as law enforcement surrounded the property. The tension was electric, every second dragging on like an eternity. And then, with a single shout, the raid began. Amelia's breath caught as agents stormed the estate, the sounds of breaking glass and shouted orders filling the air. She strained to see what was happening, her heart pounding with anticipation. And then, through the chaos, she saw him, Victor Grant, handcuffed, furious, being dragged out by two agents. Their eyes met for a brief moment. His face twisted in anger, but Amelia stood firm. The room then, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "We did it," she said, sinking into the chair beside Amelia. "But we both know this isn't over." Amelia sat tall, unflinching. She had won this battle, but the war wasn't over, not until every piece of the puzzle was revealed. The image of Victor Grant being led away in handcuffs was one she knew she would never forget. As he was loaded into a waiting police car, the weight of everything she had fought for came crashing down on her. It wasn't just about him. It was about justice, truth, and a chance to right the wrongs that had upended so many lives, including her brother's. Later that evening, Amelia sat in the quiet conference room of a federal office, exhausted but resolute. Detective Ramirez handed her a cup of coffee and offered a small smile. "You did good," he said. "Grant's in custody, and the evidence you and Sarah provided is enough to keep him there." Amelia nodded, though she knew there was still more to do. "What about his network? The people behind him?" Ramirez's expression turned serious. "We're building a case. The documents you found were a gold mine. But dismantling something this big takes time. It won't be easy, but it's a start." Just then, Sarah entered the room, her expression a mix of relief and determination. "We did it," she said, sinking into the chair beside Amelia. "But we both know this isn't over." Breath, steadying herself. This was the moment she had been fighting for. Sarah entered the room, phone in hand, a triumphant look on her face. "The story's everywhere," she said. "Grant's arrest is trending on every major platform. Public pressure is mounting, and the DOJ has officially expanded their investigation." For the first time in weeks, Amelia allowed herself a small smile. It's finally happening. The next few days were a whirlwind. News outlets dissected every detail of the case, exposing a web of corruption that stretched further than Amelia had imagined. High-ranking officials were implicated, resignations flooded in, and investigations were launched across multiple industries. The dominoes were falling, and Amelia felt a growing sense of pride knowing she had played a part in it. But amidst the chaos, her mind kept returning to one name, James. With Victor Grant in custody and the truth about the falsified evidence exposed, Amelia knew it was time to take the next step. 3 weeks later, she stood outside the courthouse where her brother's appeal hearing was taking place. Adjusting the blazer she had borrowed from Lily, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was the moment she had been fighting for. Her face as a choked sob escaped her lips. This was it, the moment she had dreamed of for so long. Amelia took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She wasn't representing James officially. That would be handled by a seasoned attorney Sarah had helped connect her with. But she had fought tooth and nail to make this day possible. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Amelia sat in the front row, her hands clenched in her lap as the defense presented the newly uncovered evidence. The suppressed security footage, the forged emails, and Grant's involvement in fabricating the case against James. When it was time for closing arguments, the defense attorney looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor, the evidence before you is clear. My client, James Carter, was wrongfully convicted due to the actions of corrupt individuals who manipulated the system for their own gain. Today, we have the opportunity to correct that injustice." The judge's decision came quickly. As he read the words, Amelia felt the weight of years of pain and frustration lift from her shoulders. "The conviction of James Carter is hereby vacated. He is to be released immediately." Tears streamed down her face as a choked sob escaped her lips. This was it, the moment she had dreamed of for so long. "Changed lives, Amelia. This is just the beginning." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as the courtroom erupted in cheers. James, now standing beside his attorney, turned to her with a wide, disbelieving grin. She ran to him, throwing her arms around him in a hug that felt like it could last forever. "You did it," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You actually did it." "We did it," Amelia corrected, pulling back to look at him. "You believed in me when no one else did. I just returned the favor." In the weeks that followed, Amelia found herself in a whirlwind of attention. Reporters wanted interviews, activists reached out with messages of support, and even law schools sent her letters of encouragement. But Amelia's focus was on what came next. Sitting across from James at their parents' dining room table one evening, she laid out her plan. "I want to go to law school," she said. "For real this time. No shortcuts, no disguises. I want to do this the right way." James smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "You'd be amazing." "You think so?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I know so," he said firmly. "You've already changed lives, Amelia. This is just the beginning. Done more than most lawyers ever will." Years later, as Amelia stood in her own courtroom, this time as an official attorney, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her here. She thought about the people she had fought for, the battles she had won, and the lessons she had learned about courage, justice, and the power of standing up for what was right. Her first client, a young single mother wrongfully accused of theft, sat beside her. Amelia glanced at the opposing counsel, ready to begin her opening argument. She smiled, her voice steady and confident. "Your Honor, I'm here to defend someone who deserves the truth, and I intend to deliver it." And with that, the journey of Amelia Carter, the genius attorney who once stood in a courtroom mocked and underestimated, came full circle.